Well, what y'all think? I like that. I just whatever you want to think about. Clyde's preaching, so he don't know, but he's leading Bible study Saturday morning, so it won't be. But we have Saturday morning. I'll just say on the first Saturday of the month, I really hadn't made a big push just because we had a small group and that's fine. But any men that want to come, 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, be the first Saturday of the month. We have Bible study. We call it Bibles and Biscuits, and we just get together and eat, and then we have some fellowship around the Word, and so. But anyway, any praises or prayer requests tonight? Yes, sir.
I have two. My wife's family, the Snipes family, Miss Brenda Snipes from Metter, they own a fuel station there. They call Hospice Inn. I just asked restoration with the son and the grandkids, and also one of my coworkers who's no longer working with us tore her ACL, and she's pretty much disabled. The company has let her go with severance, whatever.
Mm.
And she's got to move out. And it really affected me because she's been here longer than anybody else coming up there. My supervisor just called me and said, I know that Janet, her name is Janet Stevens, good employee and all, but she was honest enough to say it didn't happen at work. It happened stepping off one of her steps. And she needed all the prayer she could get.
Okay. Well, honesty pays in the end, though. It may not seem like it, but it does. Okay. Anybody else?
Still haven't said and done. Get clear, still got a ways to go before I get the bladder out.
Still hadn't found your heart.
Can't find it.
Well, I tell you, Adam and I take care of you, no problem.
I'm about ready.
Well, no, that's why they're checking to see if he's got one. But Adam and we can take that gallbladder out. Yes, sir. Pardon? That's right. Whether you got a heart or not, we can take it out. So, all right. How's baby Wesley?
He's doing good. He's growing some and all. He's still having problems with his reflux, but they've got him on the medicine. And Caitlin called me today fussing about insurance. But anyway, he's doing good.
Welcome to the real world, huh?
And y'all, well, remember Mama, she's still in pain with this arm, and I know she will be for a while, but she still says she feels like herself if I was just broken, but it's not. It's just she's bruised up and trying to get around.
I assume she's not working.
No, she's not. She can't do anything with that left arm.
Well, knowing her, it wouldn't surprise me that she didn't try.
Oh, and she's keeping me busy. She has found, I told her this afternoon, I said, now tomorrow when I come up here, I'm going to sit nice. So she's the backup stuff for me to do. But I'm having to take care of her and the dogs too, and the cats, so. They're out there spraying and stuff.
Bless you. Well, Alan's retired. Let him go. Oh. I was going to say, and Miss Faye as well. Yeah. All right. Anybody else? Okay. Okay. Others? Yes. He does. He's, I will say that he has found out some information. They have found out some information from doctors, and but I'm not at liberty to share it with everybody at this moment. But just so that you're, continue to pray that he will find what he needs. That they'll take care of everything for him. So, um, any others? Praise or prayer request? Continue to pray for Brother Keith and his family, and not only Brother Keith. If you didn't know, he shut down his shop, and now he's moving 36 years worth of stuff. And
Adam helped me yesterday a little bit today too, and yeah, he knows his sleep is a mess, but got to do something. But hey, God is good, and I've had lots of people say lots of good, loving things to me, and as you would say, they've been loving on me. So
Mhm.
good things.
Amen. All right. We'll continue to pray for Joseph and Abby and our daughter as we got babies coming, and so and other folks around that have got babies coming. And continue to pray for Miss Geraldine, and so got a lot to consider. Miss Mary Hall, All right. Anybody else? Brother David, would you open us in prayer, please, sir?
Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you again, just give you the praise and glory you so much deserve. We thank you for the fellowship and the food we had tonight. This opportunity we have just to assemble in your house, hear your word, talk to us, dear Lord. Just keep us open mind, open heart, give us the wisdom we need to understand your word better. We pray for each one that was mentioned tonight, Father, for we have many on the list. And the reason we put them on the list is because we know you are the mighty healer and the mighty conqueror. We don't just do it for formalities, we do it because we know you love each and every one of them. And ask that you just, whatever the need may be, you would just touch their lives, let them know you're there. Just go with us and guide us, each one safely home tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, Genesis 31. And this chapter 31 is all about two things. Number one, about going home. But also, in that, following God in what he wants us to do, and the obstacles that go along with that. Because when you think about it, following God is the most important thing in life. We know that. It gives us fulfillment. It gives us purpose, and and it's a fulfillment and purpose that's deep within us, and it lasts forever. And and it fills us with happiness and joy, and and it's the most secure, secure happiness and joy that we can ever even possess. But the world doesn't. When we follow the world, we follow the things of this world, the fulfillment, the purpose, the happiness, the joy of the world. None of that lasts. It's here today, gone tomorrow, as we like to say. And the world, what the world gives, it fades, it becomes empty, it becomes void, and and it leaves us so hollow and so empty. And, and that brings us, would bring us then to the question, oftentimes in people's hearts, especially those of the world's hearts, that, what's life all about? What is it all about anyway? And what's the sense? What's the purpose of it all? What good is it, or what use is it? And, what am I doing this? Why am I running this rat race, if we call it that? And so, the thing is, God does not leave us empty and hollow, and, he fills us with him, with his love, and ultimately with him, if we will truly follow him. And so, but the problem then becomes, God wants us to do that. And as I've said before many times from the pulpit, we've been sold a false bill of goods in today's modern Christianity. We say that, well, all you got to do is say a prayer and ask, the Lord to forgive you and to come into your heart and walk down the aisle and get in, in the baptistry, and everything will be rosy. Correct? But that's the way it's supposed to be. But it's not. When you choose to follow God, then obstacles pop up. There's obstacles that come against us, and we'll face these barriers and these roadblocks and these hurdles. Oftentimes, though, when we think about it from the standpoint of we leave home to go where God has called us to go, maybe to the mission field, or call us into ministry, or whatever it is that he's calling us to. But then when we do that, then there are those obstacles. There's those things in our way that we have to overcome. Well, in Jacob's case, it was kind of the opposite. He'd already been there, and now he's going home. And when you think about these obstacles and these things, that these roadblocks that kind of stood in his way, again, God has told him, go back home. And yet the world says, no, don't go back home, because Esau is there. You remember what Esau said the last time you were there? Said he was going to kill you the next time he saw you. Remember, Jacob, you were the laughing stock because you messed up and you left home. And so as Jacob faces this, and, obviously his heart is set on returning home, but, we must, we must do what he did, and that is trust God in the midst of it all. Well, let me tell you, that's the hard part. That is so hard. Because you see, we had a plan. This is how my life was going to go. This is what I wanted to see. That I was going to work this many years. I was going to retire and have this much income and do that. And then all of a sudden, maybe we get close to retirement and we get sick, or something happens and we're not able to do what, those are obstacles. And yet, God has said, trust me, my child. Trust me. And so here, as we look at the obstacles here in chapter 31, we're going to pick up in verse 1, and we're going to look at the first 21 verses here and tonight, and just kind of look at these obstacles as we go through. The first obstacle is simply this, is that there's a threatening situation. Notice in verse 1, it says, now Jacob heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob has taken away all of that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has acquired all of his wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable toward him as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family. And I love those last 6 words. And I will be with you. Again, remember 6 years ago, Jacob wanted to go home. Remember he told Laban, he said, I've worked for you for 14 years. I've got my wives, and I can't stay here anymore. I can't build any wealth. I can't be independent in here. And so, I need to go home to my family. And Laban, if you remember, said, no, stay. We'll work on a partnership. We'll do some stuff here, and I'll give you full partnership in the ranch. I mean, Jacob didn't want that because he wanted to go home. And so he entered this work agreement, kind of a minor partnership. And in exchange for his labor and his ranching skill, Laban agreed to give Jacob all of the spotted livestock that were newly born into his pure, solid-colored animals. And so throughout the 6 years of this agreement, God had blessed Jacob. He blessed him greatly, and he'd prospered and grown very wealthy. But you know, it's interesting here because when we see that, you go back into verse 1, back up, sorry, too far. Go back up, and he says that the sons, says, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's. Jacob's taken all of our inheritance. He's gotten all this stuff. They knew the facts. They knew that Jacob had started with nothing. They knew that he started, and that the herds that he owned had been bred from the livestock that was originally owned by his father. But this was the agreement between Jacob and Laban. And, you know, he heard about their grumbling, but he also noticed something else. Because in verse 2, he says, and Jacob saw the countenance of Laban. He just saw something different. He saw something different about Laban. That Laban had agreed to this 6 years ago, but I think when Laban agreed to this, he didn't think that Jacob was going to, be this prosperous. He didn't realize, Laban wasn't a godly man, so he didn't realize that God was going to bless Jacob incredibly. You know, he had begun maybe to even question the wisdom of this agreement with Jacob. Maybe he had, and listen, he had cheated Jacob more than once already. He had given Jacob a rough time. And Jacob sensed that Laban could make a move here and break the contract and, then take the herds from him. I mean, and his life, his family, his money, his possessions. I mean, all that was at risk at this point. And so he didn't know what to do. But notice in verse 3, God did. He says, return to the land of your fathers and your family, and I'll be with you. He said, you follow me? You go back to where I told you to go, Jacob. Everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be all right. You've had to walk some rough roads. You've had to deal with some issues, and there's more ahead. But you know what, Jacob? I'll be with you. I've thought about that a lot. In fact, that's the message that I'm going to preach Sunday evening at Addington that I'm working on now, and it's all about that statement, everything is going to be okay. What does that mean? Does that mean that everything's smooth? No. What it means is that, there's these obstacles, there's these things in front of us, but if you go through those things, then on the other end, everything's going to be all right. For Jacob, if he did not follow God, if he didn't obey God, then he's going to lose everything. He's going to be held in bondage here in the world of Laban for the rest of his life. I thought about that, how that threatening situations can keep us from following God. Think about people like Jim Elliot. You may not know who Jim Elliot is, but Jim and his friends, and I've forgotten their names, were missionaries. And they had a burden for the Auca Indians in the Amazonian rainforest. They chose to fly down there, and they went up by boat up the river and to where those Indians were. And these were people that had never really been out, and been in contact with the outside world, but they had a burden to share the gospel with them. And so what do? They pull up there, and they're met with Indians with spears and swords, or spears and arrows, and they were killed. Jim Elliott and his friends were killed. You see, God had called them to do this. But you know, the obstacle was that they had to overcome this. They died. But I forget exactly how many years later, Jim's wife and the other men that was with him, their wives, they all traveled back down there. And you know what? God enabled them to lead those people to Christ. You see, these obstacles that we face are awful sometimes. But you know, when you think about this, you have to, you know, when you choose to follow God, it might be something, the obstacle might be something small, it might be something, what we would say, insignificant in a way, but to us it's significant. You know, ridicule and persecution, maybe having to give up the bright lights and the pleasures of this world. Maybe losing a promotion or some business deal, or maybe losing friends, or maybe even a fiance or boyfriend or girlfriend. Losing money, your business, property. I mean, we could go on and on. The point is, there are always threatening situations, obstacles that can keep us from following God. But we have to be obedient. We must be obedient. And we have to rely upon the fact, as he told Jacob, I will be with you, Jacob. If we obey, if we truly follow him, then he'll lead us. He'll be with us. That's what I love about Jesus' statement there in John chapter 14. He says, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. You know, he promised, in the midst of all of the things that we face, he promised. And he has never broken a promise yet. There's another obstacle, I believe, that is the opposition or potential opposition from family. Notice in verse 4 what it says. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before, but the God of my father has been with me. And you know that with all my might I have served your father, yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. Now, we didn't know that up until this point, but obviously Laban did. It says, but God did not allow him to hurt me. If he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. If he said thus, the streaked shall be your wages, then all of the flocks bore streaked. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. And it happened at the time when the flocks conceived that I lifted my eyes and I saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the flocks were streaked, speckled, and gray spotted. The angel of God spoke to me in a dream and said, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes now and see. All the rams which leap upon the flocks are streaked, speckled, and gray spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. And Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he carried away all of his livestock and all of his possessions, which he had gained, and he acquired his acquired livestock, which he gained in Padam Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. I know that's a long text, but think about this just a minute. Jacob was committed to following God. But what about his family? He was concerned. So he calls Leah and Rachel out to the fields. Well, what were their attitudes going to be? Would they make the same commitment that he was going to make? Would they be willing to leave their father? Would they be willing to leave their family and friends and the place where they've lived all of their lives to probably never come back? You know, he explained everything to them. Obviously, they did. I have a feeling that they weren't aware of the change in the wages. But you know, there's a possibility that they would disagree with his decision. And so he explained all of this and his Laban's his deception, injustice, but also he explained he was very sure to put in there that God had blessed him in spite of that. And he explained God's command. That he was to leave this land and return home to Canaan. But I want you to notice a couple of things here. First of all, the command was given by the God of Bethel. The God who met Jacob at Bethel. It was there, remember? What did Jacob do? That was where he made a new commitment to God. Because he had left home and he was headed to Laban's, running from home. And that was where he made that new commitment to God. Obviously, his native land was Canaan. This was the promised land, the land that was promised by God to Abraham and Isaac. And for us, it's a symbol of heaven. That's what we're looking for. God is calling for Jacob to separate from the world here symbolically and to return to the promised land of heaven. But I love this. He received what he was hoping for. It was there in verses 14 to 16. His wives, they knew their father. They knew how he could be. They knew his, how he really was. He'd even mistreated them. And they said, he's cut us out of an inheritance. He treated us as strangers and foreigners, not as his daughters. He sold them. They said, he sold us for 14 years' labor. I can imagine they're saying, well, now don't get us wrong, Jacob. We love you. But he sold us. And he took the money that was due to Jacob and should have set it aside as a dowry. But he didn't. He used it for whatever. And so they considered God's blessing of the wealth that to Jacob to be theirs and their children. They encouraged him. You obey God, we'll follow. And of course he did. Joyfully, but nervously. He loads everybody up on camels and makes all the necessary preparations to leave. And Laban's gone away. He was shearing sheep. And, so this was a great time to make preparations without, getting Laban all riled up. But then he secretly drove his livestock ahead of him and the possessions that he had accumulated, and he secretly left. His family supported him in his decision to follow God. But if you've ever had a decision to follow God, that's a little bit of a little nervousness there, I remember when I surrendered to the call to ministry, and when I was ready to take First Church, I wasn't sure what Melissa was going to think, at first. Fortunately, she told me, she said, well, I knew you were going to be a pastor before you did. But when your family when they are in the midst of this with you and they follow it with you, you see, when God delivers us, and like he did Jacob, and he commands to separate ourselves from the world, and just like he told Jacob, and you return to the promised land. You see, our hope is that our family will also support our decision to follow Christ at all cost. Because you see, denying yourself and taking up your cross and following Christ daily, it's not a popular thing, by the way. It's not an easy thing. But you know what? God and God alone is our hope. He is the only hope we have of ever being delivered from this land of worldliness and inheriting the promised land. But I want you to notice there in verse 19, because that third obstacle is something else. It's that sin and carnality. Now I want you to notice this. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. Now, why? Was she still an idol worshiper? Still loyal to her childhood religion? The false religion that her father had? Did she maybe want the gods for her own use to protect and bless her family as they escaped her father and settled down in a strange new land? Or maybe they were valuable. Maybe they were made of gold and, worth some money. I mean, was she trying to recover some of the dowry money, that she felt that Laban had cheated her out of? Were they tied up with their father's inheritance? Again, we don't know for sure. We do know that tablets that were discovered at Nuzai around 1930 show that certain household gods were identified with a person's inheritance. It seems that whoever held the gods was recognized as the primary heir of that person's estate. So, we don't know. Maybe she was planning to give the gods to Jacob later on, so that he would be, quote, the heir, Again, we don't know. The point is, when you look at this, and, Jacob obviously had taught his family about God and about Jehovah, the only living and true God, and God of salvation and redemption. I mean, why would he not teach them? How could he marry and live with them and not teach them? I mean, his very purpose upon the earth was to follow God. He'd already recommitted himself to that back at Bethel. Jacob, he taught his family. He stayed after them until they learned and knew. And, and most likely, and I think some of the commentators talk about, it seems most unlikely that Rachel was worshiping these idols, that she stole them she didn't steal them, for her own use. Or they had to be of value. But when you see all of this, and the thing was, she didn't, obviously at the time, she didn't realize that by her stealing the gods, she was endangering her husband and her family. Because, and we'll see that later, but the point is, her sin of stealing, that was an obstacle to following God, because stealing is not of God. God forbids that. We know, and we're going to get to that in our commandment study here soon, of you should not steal. But Peter reminds us in 1 Peter 4, it says, let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. But then notice the final thing here. The fourth obstacle is simply this: personal fear. Notice in verse 20, 21, Jacob stole away unknown to Laban the Syrian, in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. So he fled with all that he had. He arose and crossed the river and headed toward the mountains of Gilead. He runs away secretly, doesn't tell Jacob. He's obviously afraid at this point. You know, he's been with Laban for how many years? 20 years now. He's been there for 20 years. And he'd married his two daughters. Obviously, they had kids. You know, they had 12 kids, 11 boys and a girl. And, 20 years, these two families had been living by one another. And Jacob and Laban had started, they were business partners. And now, obviously, we know that Laban was suspicious, but that Jacob was stealing. But, there was a good chance in Jacob's mind that Laban would not allow him to leave if he went to him and said, hey, we're leaving. But where was God in all this? Well, better yet, where was Jacob's trust in God in this? So we just read that God told him what? Get up and go back, and I'll be with you. Trusting God. Sometimes it's hard. We let the world take over. We let our minds take over. I mean, he should have gone to Laban in the strength of the Lord and firmly discussed the issue. And then he should have trusted God to take care of his leaving the promised land, for the promised land. But he didn't do that. He left secretly. He picked up and left. Kind of has a history of that, doesn't he? He didn't give Laban the opportunity even to say goodbye to his daughters and grandchildren. And he took them all knowing that, again, Laban would probably never see them again, because remember, they lived hundreds of miles apart. And he secretly left because of fear. Because he did not trust God enough to work things out between him and Laban. Don't we do that? Don't we do that? I mean, listen, we should never fear a person so much that we do wrong in order to please that person or escape from that person. You see, in every situation, we must do what we can to do right and to bear witness to the unethical and immoral person. We must tell them the love of Jesus. As hard as it might be, but above all, we must trust God and not allow our fear to cause us to do something foolish, like Jacob's fear did. You see, God promises us. He said, I will help you if you're my true believers and followers. In fact, 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. That comes from the trusting God. It comes from following him, even when the way doesn't seem clear. Any thoughts? Questions that Alan can answer?
Laban, he didn't worship the true God.
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably safe to say the entire time that Jacob was there, God's hand and blessing and favor was upon him.
Absolutely.
So that being said, Laban was blessed too
Mm-hmm.
because of Jacob being there, and so was his sons.
Yeah.
I'll sit here and I'm thinking about that. And Laban probably didn't want him to leave for other reasons as far as greed.
Well, I mean, in fact, that's what we talked about last week, was that when Laban, that's the reason he made the partnership, with Jacob, was because he said, I've recognized that God has blessed me because of you, you know. So, absolutely. Should have. Anybody else?
Today was the first meeting of new president and his cabinet,
Mm-hmm.
and the meeting was started with a prayer. I thought that was a step forward.
Amen. Amen. All right. Brother Robert, would you close us in prayer, please, sir?
Father, thanks this day, Lord. Just thanks for the opportunity we have just to come together again, Lord, and study your word. Just very mindful of all those that have mentioned here tonight, Lord, but for the loss of lives, Lord, for the sickness, Lord, we just pray, God, that you just touch those situations, Lord, and just strengthen the families, Lord, and just remove the presence. We just thank you for your word. We just pray, God, that it just be a light in our lives, Lord. We'll just go out in this lost hour, Lord, and be a light and light for that world, Lord. We just pray that you'll just bring us back here safe and sound.
Amen. Thank y'all.